Well, hi. I just wanted to, Russell and I will introduce ourselves. I think you'll be more interested in Russell than you will be in me, but which is fine. I would be too. I'm Deb Thoren Peden with Pillsbury Winthrop. We're a big firm, and I've done payments work for many years and work with some of the companies involved with Bitcoin. Far more importantly, I've got Russell Reese with me. Russell, you can introduce.
I don't know about important, but I want to say one thing. I do appreciate not putting the name Russell with a regulatory after it, because no one knew what we're talking about today. So that was good, because from my understanding earlier, there were some references to a gentleman and bad regulations and such. So anyway, with that being said, my name is Russell Reese. I'm the director of the Special Audits Division. One area that we are responsible to regulate is the money service business area. We are currently reviewing our statutes to try and make a final determination on how Bitcoin virtual currency all fits into those statutes. And we're here just to try to touch base with y'all and give a brief overview. And if ultimately you are required a license, I'll go over some of the statutory requirements.
Yeah. So this is just sort of a high-level overview of some of the requirements. But yes, Russell is in the department that if one ends up being licensed as a money transmitter or money services business in Texas, that's the department that he heads. So with that as background, I just wanted to, obviously, and I think for anybody who's involved in this industry, it has become very clear that there's a lot more scrutiny by a lot of regulators. That doesn't always mean that the regulators are concluding that everything is covered, but certainly there are more regulators and more agencies looking at Bitcoin now than there has ever been. So you've got interests ranging from certainly the IRS and the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, where they're looking at issues such as is this taxable? If it's taxable, how is it taxable? What would it qualify for? Are there tax issues related to it? And no surprise, there are many other countries are looking at the same issue. Actually, I think perhaps in an international level, there may have been more countries that have decided that it's definitely taxable, and I think the U.S. is still looking at that, although one would suspect they're more likely to lean that way. There is, for those who don't know what this agency is, there's a Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which is part of the Department of the Treasury. It's actually an office of the Department of the Treasury, also known by the acronym FinCEN, with the last three letters being capitalized. FinCEN is the U.S. regulatory agency that gets to issue all the Bank Secrecy Act regulations on a federal level. So when you hear, generally speaking, about Patriot Act issues or Bank Secrecy Act, sometimes Know Your Customer, CIP, those acronyms tend to come out of the Bank Secrecy Act. So FinCEN's the regulator that gets to issue the regulations on that. Again, part of the Department of the Treasury. FinCEN was the agency that came out with the virtual currency guidance last March. They've come out with even more recent guidance last month in connection with some of the mining activity. So that's what FinCEN is. Obviously, Senate, as well as parts of Congress, are looking at Bitcoin. You know, you've got some questions that have been raised, especially in other countries, particularly about whether or not there's any issue or possible threat to the currency of the local country. You know, so I think our government is beginning to look at that. Shifting more into a state scenario, though, you've got many states that are grappling with, what do we do with this? Do we think this falls within our regulations? Do we not think it falls within our regulations? You know, New York certainly has had some very publicized activity ranging from some subpoenas that it issued a number of months back to gather information on some companies, to the more recent discussions and I think some other material that they came out with where they're debating on wondering whether or not to issue a sort of a quasi money services business license called a bit license, which would be similar to a more traditional money transmitter license, but would be more geared for Bitcoins. I do not believe that New York has decided on that process yet, but it's just something they're considering. One thing to keep in mind is that some people very justifiably in some contexts say, well, this isn't regulated at all. a lot of the, at least some of the state statutes and the Bank Secrecy Act by and large speak to monetary value and not just cash or currency. So that's where you've got some breadth in terms of some of the regulatory scope, where there are issues as to whether or not it's already covered under some of the state and federal laws. You've got the Texas Securities Board. Last week it came out, and it was almost more of a consumer-facing piece, I think I would phrase it. You may describe it differently, which seemed to be more directed at letting consumers know that if they are getting invested in Bitcoins, that there's risks associated with that in terms of the value, and that it's not necessarily protected by some of the laws and regulations that perhaps other forms of money are protected by. So I think there's that. And as I mentioned, on an international level, I think there's about 30 countries that have begun taking positions in terms of where they're at. That said, even for a lot of those countries, they're still working through what they want to regulate, what may be allowed, what may not be allowed. So you've got a ton of different regulators and agencies looking at it, as well as different departments. The next couple of slides are just sort of at a high level in terms of the sorts of laws and regulations that can come into play. As I mentioned already, you've got federal and state taxation here in the U.S., as well as certainly international. Bank Secrecy Act, as I've already mentioned, is the regulations that apply the U.S. anti-money laundering laws and some of the anti-terrorist laws. Those are very broad in scope, by the way. The BSA tends to be written in a way that if you happen to fall within the activity, and if you're deemed to be a money services business, unless you qualify for an exception, it automatically triggers the requirements. And that law has been written that way for a very long time. That's not a new interpretation for Bitcoin. It's just how the laws actually work. Those laws are very broad, and I will say personally, I think that some of the anti-money laundering criminal statutes that the U.S. have are some of the broadest criminal statutes in the U.S. Economic sanctions laws overseen by the Office of Foreign Assets Control, which is known as OFAC. Those probably likely apply because those are the laws that basically prohibit one from doing business, except for in certain circumstances, with Cuba. Those laws tend to be written in a way where if there's any provision of any type of service whatsoever, you're prohibited from doing it. So those laws are much more absolute on their face, or they tend to be, can be country by country, can be specific to groups like certain cartels. So those laws are certainly another ones that can come into play. Securities and commodities, certainly there's been arguments that have been made that these that certain sorts of products and services related to Bitcoin should be qualified as a security or perhaps as a commodity. Maybe some advantages and disadvantages to that. I think that issue will be very factually dependent upon what's being presented. Certainly you've had the SEC look at taking some actions. There's, I believe there was a Ponzi scheme down here in Texas that sort of got brought within the scope of some of those laws. And then we've got the state money transmittal licenses. But I also wanted to let you know that for some states there are more than just state money transmittal licenses. There are bill pay laws, so that basically there are broad, and they separately provide that if in fact you agree to take sometimes money, sometimes it may be phrased as value from party A and send it along to party B, that is bill payment. Generally speaking in the U.S., most of the states regulate bill payment if you are handling funds, again, some states monetary value that belongs to somebody else. So just realize when people reference money transmittal laws, bill payment may be a separate set of laws within the state that might also need to be looked at. Interestingly enough, some of the laws even show up in check laws and check cashing laws and payment instrument laws. So if you're looking at this area, just recognize that the verbiage can change from state to state, and some states have multiple different licenses that you might need to work your way through to figure out if you fall under any of them. Oh, and then obviously some states have very specific laws related to stored value. And again, I think the stored value question will be one of how are those statutes written? Are they written broadly to monetary value, potentially giving a greater likelihood that their stored value laws will be triggered, or are they more narrowly written? Other things in this, the prepaid access I raised just because I recognize Under the federal law, virtual currency is not prepaid access, but a lot of the, or at least some of the products and services we have seen convert from time to time. So it might be virtual currency at one point, and then it will convert into something that's got a prepaid access dollar value to it, and then it may go back. And you may actually have products that, depending upon, it can actually change even within a day. That you may have a part of it where it's actually prepaid access because it's got a dollar value to it and it's something that has been paid ahead of time, in which case there are very specific laws under the federal laws that apply, and very specific requirements and strict limitations in terms of what falls outside of it, and then it may convert into virtual currency, and then maybe it will convert into a stored value instrument. So one of the things, again, as you work your way through your products and services, is you probably need, or at least what we've seen, is you have to think very carefully through how can funds flow in and out, what can they convert into, do they convert into some other valuation, and think through, because there's often a multi-legal issue in terms of what is it at that moment and what can it convert to. Virtually every state in the country has gift card laws. I recognize traditionally people think of gift cards in terms of my $20 retailer card that's been prepaid value. A lot of those laws have a lot of limitations on them. Generally speaking, if one falls within the gift card laws, there's prohibitions in many states of any sort of service fee, and prohibitions in many states and expiration dates. Now, the latter may not be an issue in terms of most Bitcoin, but the fees possibly could be, depending upon how something is set up. And although a lot of those laws exclude out prepaid value that is usable for multiple merchants, some of them are broader and some of them cover that. So I raised the gift card laws because those are tricky, and a lot of the rewards issues, that rewards value, rewards issues that come up can sometimes fall within those laws, because although people have a impression there's broad carve-outs for rewards, and there certainly are some, you have to look at how the rewards are set up and whether there was consideration given, at least in some states. You got broad privacy laws, especially if any of this is deemed to be a financial service, both at state and federal levels in the U.S. as well as international. And then you've got unclaimed property, which many of you may not have heard of, but basically every state in the U.S. says that if you've got money that technically belongs, or value that technically belongs to somebody else, it is not limited to cash. It is, generally speaking, tangible or intangible property, other than real estate, that at some point in time, if the owner of that value hasn't claimed it, you have to turn it over to the state. And which state gets that money is usually a question of who the owner is and whether you know who the owner is and where they're at. But almost every state in the country has very specific unclaimed property laws. So it's something to keep in mind depending upon what your products and services are, because that's sort of a little bit more of a hidden value that comes up in terms of some of the payment stuff. So now we'll talk about the Texas stuff.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. Thanks, Deb. Before I get into my brief presentations, I want to take a step back and let you know from Texas, we have not come out with an official position on Bitcoin. We are still analyzing the product to see how it fits within our statutes. We anticipate, hopefully, official guidance within the next 60 to 90 days. We want to make sure, I know when everyone hears the word regulator, go get them, bad guys and all that.
Run.
But in Texas, I'm just speaking from our perspective, we try to be reasonable and practical. And we don't want to squash this innovation because it is pretty cool. I have to admit, looking back and learning about Bitcoin and such, but there is what I believe reasons for licensing. And if that is a determination that we make, I want to give you a quick overview of what you may be required to do to get a license. What we're analyzing right now is our statutory definition of what currency is or what monetary value is. And right now, virtual is not specifically defined. Other state laws, they have a broader definitions, and I think maybe other states are looking more closely because of that. We do not. And we want to make sure we make those steps. I have a question for you all real quick, though, before I go into it. Why do you believe, as a purpose of the regulation, I know you're Bitcoin now, and you're offering this unique product, but what do you believe a purpose, the number one purpose from my perspective, is to regulate this type of product?
And businesses.
Business. Very good. See, how good. Purpose is, to me, consumer protection if it becomes necessary, and that's correct. What's the other big purpose of regulation besides consumer protection? To me, is number one, and then you have that old taxation. Okay, no, we're not
Safety
taxation.
and soundness?
No.
Licensing fees.
License. Okay, that's negative. No, we're going negative. No, we want positive. No.
Safety and,
Yeah. No, I know. See, there you go. Okay, you're a hard sell. That's good. And I understand regulation means money, means
safety and
cost,
soundness
means
for the
safety and
state?
I say the second purpose of our regulations, of course, is that big money laundering aspect of it. What we have to do in Texas when we grant a license is the safety and soundness, because we want to make sure that entity's here today and going to be there tomorrow to make sure that promise of funds are going to be delivered, but also at the dual purpose to ensure money laundering, tariff financing is not done too. So those two, as far as the Texas statutes, are two critical components of licensing. And then as far as taxes, FYI, we assess our industry for our costs to ensure regulations. We don't assess our taxpayers or anything else. We're a self-funding state agency, which just a side note. But with that being said, I was going to spend a couple of seconds on the ones, if it is determined that you need a license, some of the things that you might be aware of. We are dealing with a lot of inquiries right now. Who has problems, an ATM Bitcoin in Austin machine? Is anyone in the audience? Because they're popping up. I've gotten a couple, and they said they're going to be popping up in South by Southwest, Bitcoin ATM machines. But again, we're still looking to see whether it's licensable or not. One Bitcoin inquiry that I did find out, though, he was going to put his own Bitcoins into the machine. So when the person gives the dollars, they're getting the Bitcoin. So that's definitely not money transmission, no matter what our ultimate decision would be. But the machines are a little different.
But that's because it's sale by a personal
Personal's
user
own
of their own Bitcoin
That's
in
correct.
exchange, and there's no third party.
They're involved in that
Yeah.
transaction. It's just like you going up to you and
Yeah.
getting your Bitcoin. Real quick, again, I know we're on limited time here, but
You've got 10 more minutes.
do I have a few more minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. What we regulate right now is Western Unions of the world. These big companies or smaller companies, when you want to take money and send it somewhere. So the purpose of these regulations have come from that type of product. Now we're trying to look at the virtual currency and how that fits into this whole regulatory scheme. Some of our protection issues is to make sure the money's taken from consumers is there in case something happens. Some licensing issues that people have to be aware of is it's pretty stringent to get a license. People think they can fill out a form and they're going to get licensed within a few days. I just want to make sure you're aware, if it is determined and you're engaged in what we consider licensable activity, there's a hurdle. And I just want to forewarn some of y'all just what that hurdle would be to get a license. And before that, real quick, in Texas we have two types of licenses. We have what we call a currency exchange. That means like dollars for pesos. You have to have a license for that. The stringent requirements are a little less because you're really walking away with your money. Or you have what we call a money transmission license, which means pretty much everything else that can do currency exchange and everything else related to debit cards and everything related to that. Internet transactions, we regulate that. Some key requirements that you might have to have when you get a license with us is the individual owners are going to have a very detailed background check performed. Am I not following your state licenses?
Oh, no, you're doing just
I'm
fine.
okay, because
I was just catching up my slides for you. Doing
Very
fine.
good. Those individuals, such as if you want to get a license with us, we're going to look back at you. You're going to do a criminal background check. You got to get fingerprints. We want to make sure that that company, that owners are legitimate. Okay?
And do you have a multi-page form, if I recall,
It's
in
not a
terms of
little
biographical?
checkbox.
No,
Yeah, it's a significant 6-page biographical data,
with a lot of financial information underneath. So I will just say that for some of our clients that have gotten licensed in various states, Texas included, one of the hardest things for a licensee to often deal with are those biographical and financial statements that have to be obtained, generally speaking, on the directors of the company as well as the top executives. And very frequently that's the hardest thing to get because the people involved are, one can understand from a privacy standpoint, hesitant to provide that personal information about themselves. But that is just, pragmatically speaking, often one of the hardest things to get done.
I agree. I don't disagree with that. The other requirements are a couple of big requirements. We do require a bond or a deposit in lieu of. So in case that company goes under and there's outstandings to be paid, it's usually going to be based on the amount of transmissions, which, again, depending on how virtual currency is defined. But right now, if you get an MT license, you have to have a minimum $300,000 bond in Texas alone. And I also want to say, unfortunately, when you get licensed in other states, they also have their own bonding requirements. So you also have to have a bond in every different state. It can go up to almost $2 million in Texas, depending on volume and depending on the company. The other hurdle that is probably the number one hurdle to get a license sometimes is we require on an MT license an audited financial statement of the company. So what happens is if you started a new corporation, sometimes it's hard to get an audit to demonstrate what we consider a minimum net worth requirement of $500,000. So this is hard to get if you're, I hate to say, an individual wanting to say, hey, this is great, I want to get a license. I just want to give you some hurdles to consider to obtain that in Texas, and we're not unique. Other states do have additional requirements too to get a license of an MT.
You've got about 1 or 2 minutes.
1 minute. Also, besides the audit, there's permissible investments you have to maintain, and what that is to ensure you don't take all the money and it's gone too. There's limitations on what you can do to invest those funds, so make sure there's liquidity on that.
But that can be a big deal for companies because those monies that are held in permissible investments you can't use for any other purpose. So think of it as like if it's you've got $10,000, that $10,000 needs to either, generally speaking, be in a bank account where there is no encumbrance of that. It is just held for permissible investments, or T-bonds or very limited sorts of investments. So that permissible investment piece can be difficult for companies.
And I'm going to just very brief, two other things are going to be hurdles is receipt disclosures. As you know, that there's a requirement to indicate to the consumer how much value it is, where, you know, and such. So there's a hurdle, and I can understand virtual currency might be an additional hurdle to make some disclosures. And last but not least, the best part of it, you do get an examination usually on site with examiners that you can look forward to, and usually it's multi-state. So with that,
not necessarily every year.
Not every year. Some is year to 2 years.
Although if you're licensed in all the states, you have visitors from the regulatory agencies through much of the year.
We try to work with other states now. We've done a much better job, but you're pretty much a big company. You're seeing them every quarter, unfortunately. Yeah. Yes. And that's all I have.
Very good. Do you have any other good news?
Again,
Texas hasn't decided.
We haven't decided where Bitcoin is, so that's...
Well, we'll open the floor up to questions. Please come up. Yeah, we'd like to keep it. We're going to record this and for later play, if you don't mind coming up. Thank you.
I hope I have the term right. Have you guys heard of white labeling?
Sure.
In terms of how easy is it smaller players to partner up with, say, like a credit union or somebody that already has money services type business licensings in place, and to basically for us to do the Bitcoin part of the business while they do the financial part of the business or whatever. How feasible is that?
Let me make sure you're referring to like an authorized delegate agreement with a licensed entity or white paper? Is that what
or they might be referencing if you've got somebody, if you've got an activity that triggers licensure, you can have your company's name be prominent. I will tell you, you can't have the licensed entity be invisible in terms of the white labeling, so that's just one thing to keep in mind. But if you actually segregate the services so that the actual financial services piece, the actual handling of the funds, is only handled by somebody who's got licenses and you've got agreements with them. You could be an authorized delegate if you're taking the funds or paying them out, okay. Or it could just be that you're providing services around it and the pure financial service is the licensed piece.
When I'm not 100% sure, usually I tell it put it in writing to make sure I communicate correctly on that, because I would only take it from a delegate relationship when I'm familiar with, where there's an actual contract between a license holder and a, let's say, 7-Eleven to do certain activities under their license. Right. I'm very familiar with that. This other quasi, I'm not 100% sure on. So, if necessary, I'll be glad to look at that proposal, in a separate request.
Yeah. What about like a program manager?
Program manager, depending, it'd be the same issue, right? It's a question of would the program manager's name could be there. But if another entity that is licensed is the one that's actually engaged in the financial service and handling the funds, that entity usually has to be identified appropriately on the website and on receipts, et cetera. Thank you, Chris.
And Chris, I am not an attorney, just FYI. No, I understand that program manager question, but I defer to Deb on that.
I just had a question on point of sale versus banking license for ATM machines.
Okay.
So like you go to a Bitcoin ATM, you put money in, you're buying point of sale Bitcoin. You know, it's just a commodity like a candy bar in a 7-Eleven.
Okay.
So I don't think that's a banking license, but I'll let you answer that. And then you have the other one where you go to the ATM, you put in your ATM card, you type in a PIN, that's still point of sale, I think. And then there's a third scenario I think you mentioned, but can you demystify, like if I wanted to just throw an ATM machine, just like opening a lemonade stand, which transactions or at what point do I need a banking license? Because there's Bitcoin and money, but it's the same thing as selling a candy bar that you bought at 7-Eleven with cash and then reselling it and getting cash back. So
I'll defer to Deb.
Okay, yeah, so I can sort of handle that from a high level. In terms of its being a point of sale machine, it's what the machine does or doesn't do and how the funds are handled will usually determine whether licensure is required. There is no per se POS exemption, but you're right. I mean, if one's a merchant and you're only accepting value for something you have just sold through a POS machine, it is not very likely to trigger licensure. On the other hand, if there's a conversion aspect where there's value being given out to third parties, that's where you can get back into the potential licensure issues.
you mean if I sell 10,000 of Bitcoin at my ATM and then I give back a distribution of the profit to investors, that's a banking license requirement?
Well, or possibly a money transmitter license, or depending, you could have a currency exchange issue. Part of it is you've got to, and that's where Russell was saying that for the Bitcoin machine that I think he saw information about. It was interesting because the money that was being put in the machine was literally an individual who was only engaging in individual transactions, which was sort of interesting, as opposed to it's being money that's being held by somebody else. Banking licenses usually come up in the context of if there's often if there's a deposit account where there's value being held, clearly if there's lending issues, but that's where the money transmitter licenses come up, because by and large they are the only licenses where one can hold or transmit money or to take money and hold it or agree to send it on. And by the way, they agree to send it on. It's not an issue of how long, it's a question of whether it flows through the accounts by and large. So money transmitter licenses tend to be the only other accepted licensed activity in many states in order to flow through or hold funds that don't belong to you. There are certainly some exceptions. I'm not suggesting otherwise.
Any more questions? Please.
It'd be interesting to hear from you guys, Russell, how you go about finding unlicensed money transmitters in the state of Texas and new business areas like this. Kind of what you do when you find them, whether you talked about the small, individual sole proprietor kind of startup, whether there is a scale at which you start to pay more attention from an enforcement perspective, then how the different states talk to each other, and then Deb, maybe what you do in terms of state money transmission can have federal criminal impacts, as evidenced in some of the cases by some of the folks we saw talking this morning.
Sure.
Okay. From Texas perspective, there's not a lack of people forwarding information to me to review that they may or may not need a license. I'm not talking Bitcoin now. I'm talking there's a world out there of all different products besides Bitcoin that may or may not need licensable. And what I normally will do is look at their website, try to determine if it's reasonable enough to say they may or may not need a license, because in Texas we have determined if you're behind a computer and you can transact business with an entity, no matter if they're in Canada, Iraq, or anywhere per se, then you're doing business in Texas. So it will require me to write that company, and I usually do what I call a nice 30-day letter. Say, by the way, company, it looks like you may be engaged in this in Texas without a license. Please provide us the following business plans, blah, 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 so we can make a determination whether you need a license or not. Now, sometimes it's clear as mud on the website they're not, based on the terms of agreements that reviewed, but a lot of times they're hazy, they're not clear, and I can't tell you how many times when we reached out to companies and they said, oops, those are outdated terms. We need to get you revised terms of agreements. And that's the number one thing that takes our attorney so much. No, those aren't right. So we'll look at it, analyze it. Sometimes if they have to get a license, then I'm conscientious. I know people want to get out of here and get time. But the other thing I'm conscientious of when we do notify them, we have ability, whether it's a new license, like an activity that we didn't figure out needed a license before. Recently, we've made that determination. We have the ability to contact the company and have a temporary license granted. Because if you're on the internet and you try to flip a switch off and flip it on, that's death. I mean, you won't be able to do it. So in circumstances, we have an ability to give a temporary license while they go through the process to grant a full license on that activity. But we try to reach out as much as we can to contact those companies. I don't have to reach out too much. I get it. I got several different unique, probably that many that I keep reaching out and looking at. I need about 20 more attorneys because of all the unique products out there, besides virtual currency. It really keeps us busy.
Although you can, and I believe there have been times in the past where Texas has also penalized financially companies that have done that. Certainly other states don't necessarily always feel the need to write the warm, friendly 30-day letter that Russell was referencing. They instead send off a cease and desist, basically saying you either justify your activity and show us how you didn't trigger our licenses, or we're going to fine you, often with a civil fine. I know Chris had mentioned some of the potential penalties, so this is the more negative side of the conversation. Almost every state, to the best of my knowledge, provides that if one of these licenses is required and you don't have one, that technically it's a felony. Also under Federal Bank Secrecy Act laws, if you don't have a license and you're supposed to, it's a felony. So you can see where if one's got a problem, potentially there can be significant actions that can be taken. Again, some of these licenses have lots of exclusion provisions. Maybe you fit within that. Under the Federal Bank Secrecy Act, there are some exclusions for those as well in terms of whether or not you fit within the definitions. But if you do fit within the definitions and you don't have licenses, it is not an insignificant issue by and large, or it certainly doesn't have to be if the regulators don't want to look at it that way.
And let me clarify, we have fined companies, but those are willful companies that have obviously, after reviewed it, they need a license and refuse to cooperate. Then we can issue cease and desist, which we have on those companies. I was more referring to the ones that, oops, I didn't know, let's do it right, and here, let's get it right. Well, then what?
Come on up. We have time. Another 4 or 5.
I just want to let you know, additional bad news if you ever determine, well, might as well throw that out. If you are determined from the federal as far as required to be licensed, the IRS also does their own examinations. I didn't say that earlier, so might as well.
Yeah.
So, FYI. So, okay, sure, I'll just keep layering it on.
So I have a quick question about the ATMs as well. I do surety bonds actually for Bitcoiners, and I get a call all the time that says, I purchased the machine, but it is supported on the back end by XYZ exchange, right? So they're not doing the exchange. So they're always wondering, am I a money transmitter even though I just own the machine? I'm not doing any of the transmitting. Thoughts?
The one company that I thought might have needed that license while we're looking through it, he just owned the hardware. And we would not, that's a hardware issue. And I don't think that's any different on the internet when you do the pipes. If you're just doing the hardware, that wouldn't necessarily generate a required license because you don't have the control of the funds. You're just doing a piece of hardware.
Right. Which,
if I'm explaining it correct,
yeah, exactly. Which most of these ATM companies are in that situation, right? Most of them are not building out their own exchange and then supporting it by selling their, placing their own ATMs everywhere.
Right.
They're building it out and then selling it to some entrepreneur that wants to place it in a random, place. That person that bought the ATM, though, you're saying may not be a money transmitter, probably isn't, but you still want to know who's on the back end of that, right?
Who's in that process
on the exchange.
of accepting funds, exchanging that. We'd have to look at that. Once a determination on virtual currency is made, that is correct. We would have to look to who's controlling the funds.
And you also need to sometimes look at, depending on where it's placed, if the location where it's placed is also interactive in terms of getting the value in or out. That can actually make it a more complex scenario. Again, it's a factual issue bit.
forgive me if this was addressed earlier, but so I have a friend that builds ATMs in Colorado, and I want to put one in Texas. So I buy it from him, and I put in a location in Texas. So I'm already breaking a rule, or?
No, let me step back. First and foremost, again, we have not made a final determination in Texas on virtual currency at all. Okay, that's on Bitcoins. But your question is, just in any, let's say you're going to take regular currency, you bought a hardware machine from someone in Colorado, and you now going to drop that somewhere, but when that person goes to activate that ATM, is he going to be dealing with you?
Right, okay, my Bitcoins.
You're going to be your Bitcoins. Okay. The next question, I guess, is it your Bitcoins only on the machine, or are you going to go to a middle marketplace and then that goes somewhere else?
I'm going to buy them from Coinbase and put them on.
I'm sorry?
I'm going to buy them from Coinbase and put them on.
So they're your own Bitcoins on the machine. So if I go in there, I want 10 Bitcoins, they're your Bitcoins and I'm buying.
That you've pre-bought, and that's, so the ATM machine at that point only has your own Bitcoin valuation, and there is no third party involved. I mean, that's where the issues get more complex.
It's a two-party transaction. So to me, no.
In Texas.
In Texas anyway. That's how we look at it.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Any more questions?
Did I get a thumbs up for a regulator right there?
You're a nice guy.
Yeah, thank you. All right, good deal.
In closing, please take a little time to close out.
Just obviously lots of interesting issues. It's fascinating. I mean, it's wonderful products and services that are coming out of it. Lots of wonderful new businesses are coming out of it. And I think that's part of the reason why you're seeing a number of the regulators, at least from my personal perception in the U.S., looking at it and thinking about what positions they want to take, as opposed to taking what might have been an easier stance for them to take, that this is just all regulated and everybody must be licensed. So I actually think a lot of the states are actually trying to think very carefully about it, because they want to be supportive of the industry. Doesn't mean that they may not end up having a number of things licensed, but I think they're trying to think through it.
And I would confirm that, because I just think as a regulator, we're going to make sure we look at it, like I said before, reasonable, and make sure it's practical. And what we're doing is really protecting the consumer in a format that everyone can expect. Sure. And right now, until we finalize that, hopefully we'll come up with some reasonable approach on that.
And Deborah, would you tell us about your law firm and the practice? And
oh, sure. That's nice of you. Thank you.
Sure. And the name?
The name of the law firm is Pillsbury, Winthrop, Shaw, and Pittman. So it's a long law firm name, just like many big firms. We are an international firm with about 600 attorneys in, I think, 15 different cities in the world, including we have offices here in Texas. We have D.C., New York, California, many different states and many different countries. For the group I work in, I'm the head of the payments team. I also happen to be head of the privacy team, but we've worked within the payments industry in all sorts of different capacities for many years, ranging from the simplest startups to some of literally the biggest corporations in the world and everything in between. And, dealing with all the different issues ranging from, Bitcoins and some of the issues that are coming out with Bitcoins and new companies and new services that are coming up in connection with them, to more traditional money transmitters, to banks, to startups, to gift cards, to rewards points, and everything in between. But I'm lucky enough to have a group of people, including some that are local here. And we work through the things, certainly over the years, we worked with a lot of the regulators as well in terms of issues that our clients have had.
And your office is here?
My office is actually in LA, but we've got an Austin presence as well as Houston. And one of my people on my payments team is right here, and she's a local.
Hi. You want to tell us anything?
Yes, I'm Elsa Broker, and we have an office just right downtown.
We also have a booth downstairs that we do have some of the publications that Debbie, that you mentioned.
Yeah.
The FinCENS guidance. I think we have the original guidance and we have the more current guidance. So
Okay.
Yeah, it's
if
free.
you didn't hear, there's a booth downstairs today and tomorrow that has handouts.
number of publications. You're welcome to come down.
We've got big signs.
Sure. But we have these available on our website as well as we have some printed publications.
Good. It's good to know. Thank you both.
We're honored. Thank you for letting us come.
Thank you.